Could Russia still win the information war? Public opinion in the West quick to swing solidly against Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, with even the fringes of the far right and far left here muting their admiration of Moscow's strongman. But that doesn't mean that the Kremlin's spin machine has gone quiet. And while outlets like Russian broadcaster RT may now be blocked in places like France and Germany, years of eroded trust in the so-called mainstream media mean that receptive audiences the world over have long since defected to alternative news sources. That spin machine stunned the likes of France when, for instance, an under-embargo junta in Mali managed to turn public opinion against the French fighting jihadists and in favor of the Russian mercenaries of Wagner, mercenaries now reportedly headed to Ukraine. And while the international community flags Wagner's track record on human rights abuses in Syria and the Central African Republic, many West Africans shrug off the evidence, as well as Mali's spike in insurgent massacres of civilians, on the watch of Bamako's new friends. What is it about Moscow's narrative that's still so effective and powerful in so many parts? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at what's also a battle of the airwaves, and not just between Russia and Ukraine. With us to talk about it, Nyagare Bakayuko, chair of the Africa Security Sector Network think tank. Thanks for being with us. I want to thank as well for joining us from Oxford, Samuel Romani, Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute think tank. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
And joining us from Washington, D.C., Sean McFate, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, author of The New Rules of War, Victory in the Age of Durable Disorder. Welcome to the show. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, Wagner on the front lines. First, it was U.S. sources. Now it's the U.K. warning to be on the lookout soon for those Russian mercenaries turning up in eastern Ukraine. Brian Quinn has that story.
Hardened mercenaries joining in the war on Ukraine. The British Defense Ministry says more than 1,000 fighters from Russian private military contractor the Wagner Group are being deployed to the country, notably around the northeastern city of Kharkiv and in the eastern Donbass region. The report comes after Moscow announced a strategic shift in its now month-long invasion, ostensibly abandoning its goal of conquering all of Ukraine to focus on control of the Donbass. That would be a familiar setting for the Wagner Group. The firm first rose to prominence in 2014, fighting alongside pro-Russian separatists in the Donbass as they launched a Moscow-backed war of secession from Kiev. With an estimated 2,500 to 5,000 mercenaries from both Russia and abroad, Wagner has been nicknamed Putin's private army, though the Russian president refuses to even acknowledge its existence. Its operatives have appeared in some dozen conflict zones around the world where the Kremlin has a strategic interest, fighting alongside the Syrian National Army in the country's civil war, supporting rebel General Khalifa Haftar in Libya, and providing security to embattled presidents in Venezuela and the Central African Republic. The group's methods, meanwhile, have alarmed the UN and several NGOs, with Wagner contractors accused of carrying out executions, rapes, and torture in the course of their missions.
Samuel Romani, I guess it's important to be careful, right? Because we haven't seen the Wagner mercenaries yet on the battlefield. These are just announcements made in defense circles in Washington and London.
Well, yes, we haven't really seen significant involvement of the Wagner Group inside the Ukrainian battlefronts, at least in an offensive capacity. Though there have been repeated discussions, not just the latest British intelligence reports and American reports, but even before the war started, in January and February, that the Wagner Group had established a military presence in eastern Ukraine. There were also persistent reports that the Wagner Group, its forces in Central African Republic, were being deployed and being moved towards the Ukrainian theater in the days leading up to the war. So these stories are not new, but we shouldn't be careful about overestimating their involvement because we've already done that about Syrian mercenaries who ended up not arriving yet, and also overestimating their effectiveness like we did about the Chechen battalions that arrived as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's a bit of psychological warfare going on here because, as you said, there was talk of recruiting Syrians. Then we were told the Chechens would be merciless and would rule on the battlefield. None of that has materialized so far.
Absolutely, yeah. The recruitment of Syrians was expected because of Russia's manpower shortages. It obvious was that the force of around 200,000 Russians was not enough to really turn the tide. But it seems as if the only forces that the Russians are actually bringing in are 2,000 forces from Georgia. That was announced today by the Ukrainian Defense Ministry and has also been confirmed previously by American officials. So movements of Russian forces that were stationed in Abkhazia and South Ossetia after the 2008 war, the movement of some Chechens and some scattered South Ossetian forces as well. But there really hasn't been the movement of Syrians at this point. And the Chechen forces that were brought in suffered from ill discipline and were better at psychological warfare than actual combat. And also, one last thing, the Wagner Group's record in offensive capacity is actually quite atrocious. Having they failed in Mozambique, they failed in Libya once the Turkish counteroffensive began. I don't think that they're going to be making much progress in the counterterrorism sphere in Mali. They're good at stationary guarding and they're good at logistical support and sniper training, but they're definitely not good in an offensive capacity.
Nagali Bakayuko, is that your assessment of the Wagner Group is overhyped?
I think it is very important to differentiate the military operational capabilities from the informational capabilities. As far as the African continent is concerned, I think that all the experiences in Libya, in Mozambique, in Sudan, even in the Central African Republic or in Madagascar, shows that nothing has really changed on the ground from a tactical and even more strategic point of view. But if you look at Mali, where it is important to remember that the Malian authorities are denying the Wagner Group to be there, whilst Vladimir Putin has said, yes, it was there, but with no links with the Kremlin. It's important to see that even if they are deployed in the central part of the country, it is mostly in the informational field that they do have a major impact in the country.
A major impact in the country. And as we saw in the report at the outset, there's different kinds of uses for these mercenaries. In some cases, it's to protect the president. In others, it's to protect gold or uranium mines. And in waging all-out war is a different thing.
I agree, but I think it is also very important to be careful with the words we are using. I know that most of the time the Wagner Group is called as a mercenary one, but in fact it is a private security company with a very ambiguous legal status, which is making very difficult to qualify the kind of intervention it really does have. What is clear is the fact that it has a commercial stance and that commercial and profit is its main objective. This is clear. Second, that it also has an interest in influencing public opinions in the countries where it is deployed. And finally, it is also influenced in terms of training. But is it really useful to change once again the military balance between the different forces on the ground? I'm not quite sure about it.
Yeah, well, one final point on this, Samuel Romani. Is this a private security company like any other, like there are Israeli private security companies, like there are U.S. private security companies?
Well, I think that they're a little bit more of an instrument of the state than, let's say, Blackwater, or let's say Israeli private security companies. I think that the phrase that was popularized by Columbia University professor Kimberly Martin, semi-state security company, is really effective in describing them, because they are nominally private, because private military companies in Russia are banned if they're carrying out activities for the state's purposes, and they also carry out many deniable operations on the behalf of the Russian state. So they carry out political interference missions in support of candidates who are aligned with the Kremlin, We saw that in Madagascar. We've also seen that to some extent in their efforts to rehabilitate Saif Gaddafi in Libya, as well as Khalifa Haftar. And they also carry out military and counterinsurgency operations where Russia would not want to actually send actual forces. The Russians sometimes conflate the Wagner Group private military contractors with technical advisors or some others, but that's usually just a ruse. They're really aimed at carrying out orders from the Kremlin in a way that the Kremlin can hide from its own people.
And again, it's one of these situations, the way you seem to be describing it, Samuel, where the Kremlin denies that they have any links with them, but at the same time wants you to know that they have Vladimir Putin's backing.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the one time the Kremlin actually was more revealing about the Wagner Group's role was actually in Sudan, and that was only after the liberal newspaper Novaya Gazeta really revealed their role in late 2018 and early 2019 in support of Omar al-Bashir's regime. And the reason why they came out and talked about it was because they wanted to clarify that the Wagner Group was not there to repress demonstrators, but it was just there to guard gold mines. In other cases, it's just always been ambiguous. Vladimir Putin himself has kind of said that they have nothing to do with the Russian state. But when they are involved, there's clear evidence from BBC documentaries that were done last year, from interviews with former foreign fighters, that they do take orders from the main intelligence directorate, the GRU, and by extension and by proxy, the Russian Ministry of Defense. We've even seen Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and the Wagner Group's lead figure, Yevgeny Prigozhin, participate in meetings on Libya, where they were discussing military support for Haftar. So that shows broader state links.
All right, so there's the whether or not the Wagner Group can or cannot be effective on the ground in Ukraine. 35 days in, Russia has not gotten a lightning-quick win over Kiev. There are doubts over Russian military capability. Those abound. However, Moscow's information machine has once again proved formidable, and it swung into gear early in this conflict. France 24's Observer's website was able to speak with Vera. She's a resident of Kherson. That's the only major city in Ukraine taken since the start of the invasion. She witnessed the spin firsthand.
Когда тоже заглушили связь, приезжали якобы их фуры с гуманитарной помощью, с Крыма, по-моему. Телевидение их приехало. И у нас на главной площади они снимали репортаж. Даже человек пытался спросить там, по поводу гуманитарной помощи что-то. Ну, то есть это было видно, что это просто какая-то постановка.
Ребята, кому-то надо, блядь, пожрать от оккупантов. Надо не делать, надо нас спасать.
Они, может, думали, что люди будут более падкие и выйдут много, и начнут сразу в ноги кланяться и просить эту еду, но, слава богу, такого не произошло, и ничего у них не получилось, и, мне кажется, даже особого сюжета там никакого у них не получилось.
All right, what we don't see, which is what follows next, which is how it's presented on Russian television. And there you have the handout of the food, which where you see closely cropped images, and that's what appeared on Russian television, of thankful Ukrainians receiving food aid from the Russians. Your reaction when you see those images there, Nyagere Bakayko?
I think that what is very interesting is the fact that you can see a big difference between the kind of techniques that countries such as Russia are able to use compared to those used by democracies. Because in fact, it is really the issue at stake. How can Western liberal democracies have an impact in terms of influencing public opinion when they are confronted to those kinds of approaches? It is a real question which is absolutely crucial because I think today, for instance, PSYOPs from Western militaries or civil military interventions are a lot to learn from the Russian approach, but staying in a democratic, as far as possible, framework.
Yeah, because both sides make claims that prove false. That's happened since the start of this war.
Exactly.
We had, for instance, remember that the people who told that Russian ship to go away. Originally, it was reported they had died. Turns out they didn't. We saw one of them that get decorated with a medal on Wednesday and Tuesday, excuse me. But the Russians, their spin machine somehow seems better.
Exactly, that's what I mean, in fact, because we can see how efficient it has been, for instance, in countries such as the Central African Republic or in Mali, where they have been able to build this informational approach, warfare, in fact, on a broader environment which was not very favorable to Western partners, in particular to France, and they have been able to exploit in a very smart way, even if very cynical.
Very cynical way, smart and cynical. Samuel Romani, it's not like any of this is a surprise. We all remember the accusations of Russian meddling in the U.S. elections in 2016, in the Brexit referendum, and so on and so forth. The list runs long. And yet here we are now at this point where suddenly do you feel as though the West is in any way better equipped to answer this spin machine?
Well, I think the West has taken a drastic measure in terms of defanging the key elements of the Russian spin machine by banning RT and Sputnik. And that ban on cable media is not really that impactful, though, because most of their audience and most of their viewership is really coming through social media. So the ban on YouTube, I think, was much more significant than the ban of television. Switzerland is one of the only countries that has not done that, and their arguing is on the grounds that it's better to combat disinformation with facts. But that doesn't seem to be a mainstream view within Europe. What I'm more concerned about, though, is
that your view, by the way?
That was Switzerland's view.
But I'm asking you, Samuel. What do you think? Is banning RT, the Russian television network, and banning Sputnik, their news agency, is that the way to go?
Well, I think it has a neutral impact because the audiences that would be appealing towards RT and Sputnik are coming from the far left and the far right of the spectrum often, and there often are people who gravitate towards the narratives to begin with. So even if they can't find those kind of narratives in RT and Sputnik, they will find other sources of information that will reinforce them. So it's really hard to tell whether this is going to really have much of a positive impact on it. We definitely are seeing some far-right parties within Europe kind of cool off their ties towards endorsing the Kremlin. But then equally, you're seeing others, like there was a representative from the AfD that was just talking about the Azov battalion and neo-Nazism inside Ukraine yesterday. The Russian media was hyping up. These far-right narratives are still pushing pro-Russian lines, and that hasn't changed whether RT or Sputnik is there or not.
Hasn't changed whether RT or Sputnik is there or not. France 24, by the way, banned in Russia. Retaliation for state broadcaster RT being banned over here, as Samuel was saying. Now, we, along with sister station Radio France International, are also banned in Mali. Mali, whose junta dropped support from France for the Russian mercenaries of Wagner last November, before it had to pull out. Paris was surprised to find protests on the route of a French military convoy going from Abidjan on the coast in Ivory Coast to Gao in northern Mali. Protesters in places repeated, for instance, the false claim that the French were secretly allied with jihadist insurgents. If you roll back the clock to last November, Nyagare Bakayoko, and you were here to talk about it with us at the time, is there anything that could have been done differently? Or because now we're seeing that Russian, quote, Russian narrative is being spun more than ever now that the French are being forced out.
I definitely think there is a need not to consider that the African public opinion are necessarily manipulated by external actors, be they Russian, be they French, because today it seems that there is no real public opinion in those countries, which is completely untrue. In fact, you also have spontaneous reactions against international presence, French intervention, most of the time not relying on those fake news, but in fact really relying on the fact that those international interventions have not been able to change the situation on the ground, both from an individual perspective or a collective one. And it is very important not to overlook the real public opinion, which today is really disappointed by what has been done by Western partners. But it is also true that there are lots of fake news, of disinformation tactics which are used both by some international partners, and I think that, of course, Russia is one of them, but also by some African governments. I will finish because you were talking about what happened with this French convoy. In fact, in Burkina Faso itself, it was former President Kaboré who tried to push this problem with this convoy to avoid himself to be accused about a massacre of gendarme units a few days before.
Yeah,
so
it's
exactly. So it's important not to read everything through the lens of the Russian influence.
But nonetheless, it's, this claim that the French military was in cahoots with the jihadists. I mean, for people here in France, that's a bit insulting since they've there's been loss of life on the part of the French.
And it is definitely insulting, but that is why it is important to understand that it is not all Africans or Sahelians who are giving credibility to such fake news, but only the most activist part of those public opinion.
All right, back in December of 2020, this is before that convoy left, there were French efforts to counter the Russians that backfired very badly. Facebook blocked 3 networks running multiple accounts, Facebook accounts and Instagram accounts, 2 linked with Moscow's notorious troll farm, the Russian Internet Research Agency, and the third had, quote, links to individuals associated with the French military. Both violated policy against coordinated inauthentic behavior, as it's called. And Niagare Bakayuko, the French have reacted since. Their sort of counter-cyber warfare body now regrouping. They've learned the lesson from that incident. They tried to play by Russia's rules, and it looked bad.
That's exactly what I was referring to previously, because, for instance, a few days ago, you had an incident in Gao City where PSYOPs officer from a Barkhane operation were making interviews of local people to ask what were their perception of the French presence. And in fact, it's been very badly perceived by the authorities. And the Gao government asked the French Barkhane force to stop all those interviews, saying that, no, France definitely is not allowed to manipulate like this the local opinion. So yes, unfortunately, there is still a lot to be learned.
All right, the tech gremlins could not keep away Sean McFate, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and author of The New Rules of War, Victory in the Age of Durable Disorder. Thanks for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
Thank you for having me.
Let me begin by asking you, because our conversation has centered a lot around, I guess, I don't know, what do you call it, psyops, or the fact that this information war is such an important factor. And here we are with Niagale and as well with Samuel talking about France's involvement in Mali, but it's a spillover from, well, Russia's invasion of Ukraine shows that there's a real global context. The war goes beyond the borders of Ukraine.
That's right. So, Russia, as we all know, has become a disinformation superpower. And they've, until recently in Ukraine, have used this to great effect. We live in an information age. We have for the last 30 years, and we will for the next 30 years. And in an information age, weapons that manipulate information are now more important than just force, firepower. And that's what they've done with the Wagner group, with the troll factory, and with other things in the Middle East, in Africa, and elsewhere around the world.
Yeah, and Samuel Romani was saying earlier how the Wagner Group's effectiveness on the ground, its track record's not all that great, but it's this sort of street cred, this rep that it has of being formidable that is what matters more.
Yeah, so let's back up a bit. I mean, Russia has launched sort of expeditionary military operations in the Middle East and Africa for the first time since the 1980s. And their weapon of choice is not Spetsnaz Special Forces or the SVR intelligence. It is the Wagner Group. It is these sort of elite mercenaries. Many of them come from Special Forces backgrounds. And they work like covert warriors for Russian interests. And they give the Kremlin great plausible deniability, which is key in modern warfare. And they also work with their sister company called the Internet Research Agency, or the Troll Factory. They're all owned by the same oligarch who's close to Putin, whose name is Prigozhin. And what happens is that they work together. So the Internet Research Agency, the Troll Factory, lays out a thick disinformation fog of war, and the Wagner Group slithers through it for victory. And this is partly how they took the Ukraine and the Crimea in 2014. So when the West was still scratching its head about what exactly was going on in Ukraine, the Crimea was a fait accompli.
And you heard Niagale saying the way to counter it is definitely not to try to repeat its methods. We saw the French get burned with that back in 2020. So how do you counter that double whammy of these mercenaries, quote unquote, and the troll factory?
It's a good question, and here's what I would recommend. First of all, this new way of warfare depends on plausible deniability. So we have to make implausible deniability, using what information we have and make sure we can filter it to the media to expose, hey, here's the Wagner Group on the ground someplace in Mali. Here's them using, posing as mining workers to extract mining and sending it back to Russia. Or an alternative, a little bit darker, is if Russia says, hey, those Wagner groups really are not there, then who will miss them if the French military make them disappear, right? In terms of disinformation, we can only play, we can counter it by trying to reveal the truth, but we can't do it fast enough. It's sort of like being a goalie at a football match with a penalty shootout. You can be really good, but you can't be perfect. There's a couple things that we can do. One is that we consider disinformation of ourselves, but democracies really can't do that for very long. I think some of the things that we can do is try to find ways to make French citizens better consumers of information without engaging in censorship or overbearing. So we all have, we know the problem of clickbait, right? We all have clothes that say, made in, Vietnam, made in Bangladesh. I'm sure for the guests in the studio there, it's like made in Milan, made in Paris, but not in Washington. But can we do the same thing for clickbait, saying made in Tehran, made in St. Petersburg? Would that influence French citizens from not clicking on it? We need solutions that are not overbearing, but can help, make better consumer choices about information received.
And we saw a clip earlier, Samuel Romani, from our fact-checking website. The Observers and most major media outlets now have their own fact-checking websites. Listening to Sean McFate, one question that I ask myself and that panelists have asked a lot in the past is to become better consumers of media, why is it not yet that it's not part of some kind of civics classes for children at a young age to learn how to consume their news?
Well, that would be something that would be very good to come forward. I just don't think that the education system is really adapted to the age of social media. and also the age of this kind of coordinated and pronounced disinformation, because the threat that we need to be looking forward to is not just Russian disinformation operating in isolation, but Russian disinformation operating in concert with disinformation from other countries, in particular China, maybe to a lesser extent Iran. And we're already seeing the synthesis of Chinese and Russian narratives in a major way, first of all in Africa, where Xinhua, which is having opening bureaus all over the place, is kind of reinforcing the narratives of RT and Sputnik in terms of anti-colonialism, and by implicit extension, anti-Westernism, because they kind of make those two things the same thing. And now in the context of Ukraine, where we're seeing Chinese media outlets condemn, in some ways, some of the Russian war crimes by showing footage of them, but also playing into the narratives about denazification and about NATO expansion and NATO aggression causing this war, without really going as stridently as Moscow. So that combined threat is something that we should be educating children and educating university students in, and dealing with at a more practical level.
Yeah, the Chinese trying to hedge, Samuel, and it's interesting because right now the Russian foreign minister is in China today, and he's going to be in India on Thursday, another country that's a huge media market and that is trying not to pick a side as hard as it can yet. And what you're saying effectively is that's impossible.
Well, I think in some ways it's very hard not to pick a side, because I think that if you're really not on the side of opposing Russia's invasion, you're kind of implicitly having to buy into or feed into some of the narratives that come from the Russian side. So basically, the idea that Russia's hand was somehow forced to invade because Russia was being disrespected for a prolonged period of time, and NATO expansion was posing a threat to it, and Russia needs to defend its sphere of influence. That's the usual counter-argument to justify neutrality. And when you take that counter-argument of neutrality, you end up embracing pro-Kremlin narratives. And that's a trap that India has found itself caught in, China has found itself caught in, Brazil, Mexico, and many Middle Eastern countries also have found themselves caught in that vortex of trying to be neutral, but ultimately embracing pro-Kremlin narratives, whether by intent or whether by accident.
Whether by intent or whether by accident. And again, if we're going to expose facts, France is out in Mali. Wagner is in. Let's just have a word, because it's important to talk about it. The situation in the so-called Three Borders region. Hundreds of civilians have been killed in the past couple of weeks. That's that region of Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. Here you see two towns where 16 government soldiers were killed last week. These are near the villages of Tessit and Boni inside of Mali. And when you see that it's not going great at all inside of these countries, there isn't more safety for civilians. What made people outraged, as you mentioned earlier, Nyagere Bakayoko, how do you report on this again and do it in a factual manner?
Yes, definitely the security situation is deteriorating every day more. And what will happen to the Russian partners will be, in my view, exactly the same as what happened to Western ones, because they will not be able to change the strategic situation on the ground. But what I would like to say also about this question of information, for instance, in the Malian or Sahelian context, is the fact that it is very difficult to know which sources are in fact reliable. Who is it possible to believe? Because, for instance, if you refer to the United States, there was a very serious incident with this involving special forces in Niger. And that's when the public opinion discovered that the US was, in fact, in the country. The same when France, for instance, after what happened in Bouti, the explanations given by the French military, which were opposed to those of the United Nations.
Yeah, there was an operation to take out jihadists, which instead took out a wedding party.
Exactly, but according to the French sources, it was definitely not a wedding, but only a group of jihadi people gathering, whilst according to the UN, it was in fact a meeting involving both. And public opinion under such circumstances find it very difficult to rely on any sources. So to me, it is a key challenge today to make reliable the information which are disseminated by the so-called democracies, Western democracies.
Okay, so Sean McFate, let me ask you just for a second to play communications director. We saw this incident the last couple of days, and the pictures have circulated widely of what appeared to be Russian soldiers on a dairy farm near Kharkiv being shot in the legs or outright killed, it seems, by Ukrainian soldiers. They seemed verified, but again, our France 24 observers are still checking over them once again to make sure, because we're not certain that they are. What do you say? We heard the government of Ukraine, which has not owned up to it, but also told its own soldiers, don't kill prisoners because that's a human rights violation. What do you do in such a situation when you have these kinds of videos that we're not sure yet, we're not 100% sure whether they're verified or not? We seem to have lost the connection there with Sean McFate. Can you hear us, Sean? All right. Well, we'll try to link up with him again. I'll put it to you, Samuel Romani. What do you do in those situations? Because we're living in a new age. It's an old school war. This invasion of Ukraine, an old school invasion, the likes of which the European continent hasn't seen since Cyprus in '74, and yet. Yet at the same time, you have these sort of asymmetrical elements to it, including these videos.
Well, yeah, it's basically an old-fashioned war, like a 19th century war almost, of new imperialism and neocolonialism from the Russian point of view, being fought with 21st century technology, right? So it was kind of like apropos when David Petraeus, right before the war started, said this is kind of the first TikTok war that we've ever seen, right? It's a war that's being fought over videos and narratives and stuff like this. And it just hasn't come to the attention of social media companies of exactly how to deal with it. It's interesting, just anecdotally and also from consulting with other researchers that I've worked with, that even though the Russians have banned Twitter, on Twitter as a platform, there seems to be an increased amount of activism from pro-Kremlin bot networks and troll networks, often posing as people from third countries, so countries like Pakistan, countries like India, countries throughout Africa and Latin America, claiming to support Russia. The I Stand With Russia hashtag trending was a classic example. And Western social media companies don't know what to do with it. And right now, they're erring on the side of not censoring rather than actually censoring. And even when embassies post this information, there's really only one time where the social media companies acted, and that's when Twitter took down the Russian embassy to Britain's post, claiming that the bombing of the maternity hospital in Mariupol was a forgery and a fake.
Sean McFate, we thought it would be a global conversation. Russians love Instagram, for instance, and yet now they're not getting their Instagram feed anymore, so we're not all speaking on the same platforms.
Yes, I think that this war in many ways has become a war of memes, and simply cutting Russia off of Instagram and others, in many ways does reduce their platform, but they also seem to be pretty clever at getting their message out other ways. They can be cunning in the past, but I do think that what they are betting on is that in the West, we have free companies. They are not tools of autocracy. And, companies like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, they also have a vote in this too. And the question is, can governments lean on them for government national security purposes in a durable way? I don't know if that's the case long term, but certainly short term, it's good to see that some of this is happening.
Yeah, although we all remember where you are, there was quite a storm when Twitter banned the then president of the United States, Donald Trump.
Yes. And comparing Donald Trump to Russia, the comparison's been made before. But it shut up Donald Trump for good or for bad. It shut him up. And a lot of his followers were saying, look, this is not a democracy. This is, not freedom of speech. But let's remember, Twitter it's a company. It's not a public utility. So I think we have to reimagine ownership of this space between not just the substance, but who facilitates it. And I don't think we're at that frontier yet, even though we've certainly had some clashes. But you're correct. When Twitter took Donald Trump off of Twitter, it really adversely impacted Donald Trump's messaging campaign or messaging strategy or reach.
Now, getting back to you heard Samuel Romani there saying how, Russia's not on Twitter right now, but the Russians are getting their message across here to us on that same social medium.
Absolutely. The question of the medium itself, not the media as such, is absolutely crucial because they are also perfectly using those technologies which are being forged in the Western part of the world. But what is also important to remember beyond the case of Donald Trump is that in the realm of international relations, there has been campaign from the West which have been very damaging in terms of information. For instance, what happened in Iraq, it is always in all the memories saying, yes, but the UK, the United States have been lying to us. So how can how can we consider them as reliable? That's what we can hear very often, not only in Africa, but also in Europe. So there is also a need, I think, for liberal democracy to regain trust from the public itself.
That was 2003. They still haven't regained the trust. Far from it, you're saying?
I think it's been very, very damaging.
All right. Before we go, look at how the war is being spun to the Russians themselves. The nightly broadcast on main channel Russia 1 was fairly understated during the pre-invasion buildup, but then went full throttle once the war began. Same with the all-news station Russia 24, which floated the claim on Tuesday that Russia intervened to stop Ukrainians from blowing up the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. That would effectively be suicide since Chernobyl's on Ukrainian territory.
It's a good thing that we took over security of the Chernobyl and Zaporizhia nuclear power plants. We should also take over those of Khmelnytsky and Rivne, because you don't know what those bastards are capable of. Another danger that can't be ruled out, criminal negligence by Ukrainian administrators. In a situation where a state's collapsing and losing control, experts believe the probability of a technical catastrophe rises, especially when it's accompanied by an ideology of Russophobia and neo-Nazism.
All right, that the Ukrainians were actually, the reason they invaded was they were actually plotting, Samuel Romani, to blow up Chernobyl. That's the claim of one pundit on Russia 24. But yeah, we talked about, you mentioned earlier how Russia is very good at infiltrating the West with its information. What does the West do? How does the West get its narrative across to Russia?
Well, that's extremely difficult right now because the banning of RT and Sputnik has come with a double-edged sword. And that's something that I've been concerned about, is the loss of Russian disinformation in the West, which is undoubtedly a good thing, worth basically destroying a large amount of access to independent media for ordinary Russians. So the Russians now can access the BBC, CNN, France 24, and so many other networks that could give them an alternative side of the story. So it's very limited what the West can actually do to reach the Russians, particularly because the Russians have also cracked down on independent media in their own country, like Echo Moscow or Drozd or now Novaya Gazeta, the only liberal newspaper, suspending publications until the war is over. So what they'll be hearing more of is Ukrainians shelling themselves, that the Ukrainian army is basically composed of Nazi militants and 4.5 million human shields, NATO's launching a war on Russia, and other narratives, and nobody's there to refute them. So that makes it also harder for people to engage in collective action against Putin's regime and risk the 15-year prison sentences and other draconian measures that Russia has just enforced against them.
Is this the start of a new era worldwide, Sean McFate? It's a final question for you. Old school printed newspapers, they had an obligation to not publish lies and disinformation, otherwise they'd be sued. The era of anything goes on the internet, is it over?
I don't think so. I think the era of no editors, that might be at endangered species. But I think the best way to counter Russian disinformation within the Russian population is find ways for them to Google whatever they want, right? I mean, maybe we can use pirate VPNs we can dissimulate, or maybe things like Web3, a new technology that sort of makes it harder for governments to control what is transmitted on the internet. There may be opportunities for the truth to sort of come out as long as people can find the information that they're seeking. But I do think that the era of editing, and I think unfortunately that is right now on the wane. Hopefully people realize what they're missing and will pay for a trusted news source. That's become something people have said for the last 20 years. But I think increasingly as people start to see the damage, the disillusionment, societies tearing them apart from within in the United States of America, blue versus red, there's an increasing understanding that these are not organic disputes within a democracy. Some of these problems are being lit on fire by external actors and manipulated. People do not like being manipulated.
People do not like being manipulated. That'll be the final word for now. Sean McFate, I want to thank you so much for being with us from Washington. Samuel Romani in Oxford. Nyagari Bakayoko, thank you. And thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.